Okay, let's unpack this. We've got quite a stack of sources here covering centuries of history, law, really diving into the foundations of ancient governance.
That's right. We're going from, the Greek city-states with all their, let's say, participatory energy.
Maybe chaos.
Yes, maybe chaos is a good word for some of it. And then shifting gears into the much more structured, formal world of the Roman Empire.
Yeah, and the goal today, our mission, if you like, is to really dig into how power worked back then, how it was won, how it was kept, how it got written down into laws. We're hunting for those surprising bits, the paradoxes.
Exactly. Not just a timeline, but the mechanics underneath. How societies were shaped, sometimes warped, by power, and how law tried to, well, sometimes contain it, sometimes enable it.
And we're starting with a moment that seems on the surface like incredible mercy, but maybe wasn't, right at the end of a huge war.
Absolutely. We're talking 404 BC, the Peloponnesian War is over, Athens is crushed, defeated, utterly at the mercy of Sparta and its allies.
And some of those allies, like Corinth and Thebes, they had a pretty straightforward plan.
Oh, yeah. Brutal, but straightforward. Level Athens, sell everyone into slavery, wipe it off the map. Standard practice, you might think, for a vanquished rival.
The kind of thing you'd almost expect after such a long, bitter conflict. But Sparta said no.
They did. The sources are clear. They resolutely rejected the barbarous proposal. Now, was this a sudden attack of conscience? Probably not.
So what was it then?
It seems like pure political calculation, really. Dressed up maybe in a bit of historical reverence, they apparently argued they couldn't just destroy a city that had done so much for Greece against the Persians decades earlier.
Invoking the Persian Wars. So Athens' past glory saved it, but for strategic reasons.
Pretty much. Sparta likely realized that a completely destroyed Athens would create a power vacuum. It might destabilize the whole region, maybe empower rivals like Thebes too much. Keeping Athens around, even weakened, served a purpose. It was about managing the future, not just punishing the past.
That makes sense. It shows that even in total victory, there's this complex calculation happening. Power isn't just force, it's strategy, political memory, managing stability.
Exactly. It's about setting precedents, thinking about the long game.
And that idea, that balance between ambition and, let's say, calculated restraint, that takes us right into how the Greeks saw their big conflicts, both outside threats and, maybe even more damaging, their internal rivalries. So, thinking about those outside threats, who did the Greeks see as their destined adversary? The sources seem to point pretty clearly in one direction for a long time.
Yeah, for about 2 centuries, it was really the Medes and Persians. They were framed as the great antagonists.
And what's fascinating, or maybe ironic, is the sources point out they weren't completely alien.
Not at all. The texts emphasize there were folks of Aryan speech, like the Greeks. So linguistically related, distantly perhaps, but related. The clash wasn't fundamentally about ethnicity, it was about political systems.
You had the huge centralized empires of the East versus the fragmented, diverse world of the Greek city-states. Democracies, oligarchies, all sorts.
Precisely. It was a collision of political structures. And interestingly, the first major contact wasn't a big battle like Marathon. It started much earlier, on the edges.
On the remote fringe, as one source puts it. Where exactly?
Cyprus. The Assyrians called it Yatnan. We often forget this, but way back in the 8th century BC, long before Persia was the main player, Assyrian power stretched right out to the Mediterranean.
And the rulers there, including Greeks, had dealings with Assyria.
They did. Emperor Sargon in the late 8th century received submission from kings in Cyprus. And the records explicitly mention Greek rulers like Eteandros of Paphos and Pythagoras of Sicyon.
So the first relationship wasn't defiance, it was submission, paying tribute.
That's the key point. For a significant period, the Greek interaction with these Eastern empires was from a position of weakness, or at least acknowledgement of superior power. That really frames the later conflicts differently, doesn't it?
It really does. Now, that's the external picture. But the internal Greek conflicts, they were just as defining, maybe more so. Let's talk about Athens and its empire.
Yeah.
It didn't start as an empire, did it?
Now, it began as the Delian League, an alliance against Persia. But the sources say the allies kind of slid unconsciously into subjects. It wasn't necessarily a sudden takeover.
More of a gradual tightening of the screw.
Exactly. Athens gained enormous power, collected tribute, dictated policy, but it came at a cost. They became doubly unpopular, not through one big act of tyranny, maybe, but through constant low-level coercion needed to keep the system going.
But did the average Athenian citizen see it that way? As coercion?
Probably not entirely. The sources talk about the citizens' love of Athenian ascendancy. It was seen as both passion and patriotism. They believed in their right to lead, their mission, maybe even their superiority. And let's be honest, the empire brought in lucrative revenue and political power.
Democratic imperialism, you could call it, justified by the people themselves.
That's a good way to put it. And that very passion, that belief in their right to rule, ultimately led them into the Peloponnesian War, which they lost.
Which brings us back to Sparta, the victor. They claimed they were fighting to liberate Greece from Athenian dominance.
That was the rhetoric, the high moral professions, as one text puts it. Restore liberty, break the empire.
But how long did that noble stance last after they actually won at Aegospotami?
About 5 minutes, it seems. The sources are quite blunt. Sparta achieved the goal, freed the cities, and then immediately decided to take them under its own control. A pretty cynical turnaround.
So much for liberation. They just swapped one master for another.
Pretty much. The moral high ground evaporated instantly. But what's really insightful here, according to the analysis we have, isn't just the hypocrisy, it's the institutional failure that followed.
What do you mean by institutional failure?
Sparta's whole system, its rigid social structure, its military focus, the Lycurgan laws, it was built for controlling the Peloponnesus, managing the Helots, maintaining land-based power. It just wasn't designed for running a sprawling maritime empire across the Aegean.
They didn't have the flexibility, the administrative tools.
Exactly. They lacked the bureaucracy, the naval tradition, the diplomatic skills needed. Their institutions were too rigid. They couldn't adapt to this wider sphere. Trying to hold on to that empire basically broke their system.
So their own internal structure doomed their imperial ambition.
Yes, it led to, as the source says, calamity. They were forced to retreat, essentially. It's a classic case of a system being incredibly effective for one purpose, military dominance at home, but totally unsuited for another, governing an empire abroad.
That failure is fascinating.
Yeah.
And it makes us turn back to Athens again to look inside their system. How did Athenian ideas about justice and obligation work, or maybe fail to work?
Right, moving from Spartan rigidity to Athenian law. It's like stepping into a completely different world. Think less marble columns, more noisy marketplace.
How so? What was the defining feature?
It was incredibly participatory, but also strikingly amateur. The judges, often thousands of them in the big courts and the people arguing the cases, no formal legal training, none. Justice depended entirely on regular citizens deciding to bring a lawsuit.
Wow. So if it wasn't about citing legal codes and precedents like we imagine, what were they actually arguing about in court?
It was heavily focused on character, reputation, what seemed probable, the sources are really clear on this, deciding if an act was legally right or wrong got completely mixed up with a general moral assessment of the person involved and the act itself.
So you're standing in the community, your perceived morality could basically make or break your legal case.
Absolutely. If the jury decided they didn't like you or thought you were generally a bad character, you were in trouble, regardless of the specific legal points.
That makes sense then. Why something like hubris would be such a big deal in Athenian society. It wasn't just being arrogant, was it?
No, hubris was much more serious. It was an act of extreme violence or insolence aimed at deliberately shaming and degrading someone, violating their honor and status. And classic examples involve sexual honor, things like rape or adultery.
The sources mentioned victims might be ashamed to even report these.
Yes, precisely because the act itself damaged their public standing. But the city still recognized these as incredibly serious offenses, almost political injuries, because they disrupted the social order built on honor.
And adultery, specifically.
Yeah.
That was seen as hubris against the husband, damaging his honor publicly.
Exactly. It wasn't just a private matter. It was a public insult that demanded a public response to restore the husband's honor. Now, the husband might catch the adulterer in the act and could legally kill him, but short of that.
There's another rather notorious form of revenge.
Yes, one designed for maximum public humiliation of the offender. We're talking about the practice of raffinizin.
Which of old? A rash?
Yes. Anal insertion of a large radish, sometimes along with other painful procedures. It sounds shocking, and it was meant to be. It wasn't about a fine or jail time. It was about ritual degradation, a physical and symbolic stripping of the adulterer's status to counteract the dishonor done to the husband.
That really underscores how central public honor was.
Yeah.
Maybe even more than written laws about, say, theft.
It suggests that maintaining civic order was deeply tied to these public displays of status and the restoration of honor when it was violated. The severity shows how deep the injury of hubris was felt.
Okay, this focus on community, obligation, honor, It also plays out in how the city was funded, right?
Hmm.
Particularly by the wealthy. There's a really interesting paradox there.
There absolutely is. We're talking about the liturgia liturgies. These were public services like funding the outfitting of a worship or paying for a dramatic chorus at a festival. Hugely expensive undertakings, shouldered by the richest Athenians.
And the official ideology was that this was voluntary.
Yeah.
A patriotic duty freely undertaken.
That was the official line, yes. A citizen proudly choosing to give back to the city. Good PR for the democracy, showing its wealthy citizens contributing willingly.
Oh, the wealthy knew it wasn't really a choice.
That's the contradiction at the heart of it. Our sources show these wealthy men openly talking about these duties, using words like necessity, enenko, and even commands or orders from the city. They explicitly compared the financial burden to being conscripted into the army. It felt compulsory.
So it was basically a tax, but disguised as a voluntary contribution. Why maintain the fiction?
Well, the fiction was useful. It upheld the democratic ideal, making it seem less like the state was coercing the rich. Calling it patriotism made it harder to challenge legally or politically than a straightforward tax might have been.
And it probably encouraged competition among the wealthy, too, to outdo each other in generosity.
Exactly. It harnessed social pressure and the desire for status. You were voluntarily contributing, but everyone knew you had to, and how much you gave reflected on your standing. It was a clever, if maybe slightly dishonest, way to fund an empire without calling it direct taxation.
Okay, from that internal contradiction, let's jump to a moment of total crisis for Athens.
Yeah.
Right after the defeat in the Peloponnesian War, when the democracy itself collapsed.
Yes. The defeat paved the way for the rule of the 30 tyrants, an extreme oligarchic faction. And a central figure there was Critias.
He seems like a complex character.
Very. Son of Callistrus, wealthy aristocrat, known as a pupil of the famous rhetorician Gorgias, a one-time associate of Socrates, a writer, and an absolutely ruthless politician. His intellectual background gave him a kind of credibility to argue for dismantling the democracy.
And they used the existing democratic structures to do it initially?
Kind of, under extreme pressure, mind you. The Spartan admiral Lysander was basically standing over the assembly. In that atmosphere of intimidation, they passed a motion, proposed by a man named Dracontides, to appoint this committee of 30.
Their official job was to write new laws.
That was the pretext. The real aim was to establish an oligarchy, suppress opposition, and completely overturn Athenian democratic traditions, which they did brutally.
And this brings Critias's old associate, Socrates, into the picture, because Socrates' teachings were later used against him at his own trial.
Yes, the accusations against Socrates weren't just about impiety. A major charge was about his influence, particularly on controversial figures like Critias and Alcibiades. His accusers claimed he taught his followers to basically disregard everyone else, family, friends, the city's laws compared to him, Socrates, the supposed wise man.
That sounds like a direct attack on the foundations of Athenian democracy, which valued tradition and broad citizen participation.
It absolutely was. The specific claim was that Socrates taught that you shouldn't respect or listen to fathers, nor other relatives, nor well-intentioned friends, but only listen to those who are wisely capable of benefiting you.
Wow. That sounds like intellectual elitism weaponized.
Precisely. It could be interpreted as saying only the wise few, like Socrates and maybe his oligarchic pals, truly mattered, and traditional bonds or democratic consensus were worthless. In the political climate after the 30 tyrants, you can see how that accusation would be incredibly damaging, painting Socrates' philosophy as fundamentally anti-democratic, even providing a justification for oligarchy.
Okay, let's shift westward now. We're leaving the moral dramas of the Athenian courts behind and heading to Rome. And the feeling is immediately different, isn't it? More pragmatic, maybe? Definitely more formal.
Oh, absolutely. The shift is stark. With the Romans, especially in law, the form of an action or agreement often mattered just as much, if not more, than the underlying intent. This comes through crystal clear in how they classified contracts.
Right, the famous 4 categories: verbal, literal, real, and consensual.
And the crucial thing to get here is why they were named that way. It was because they required specific formalities over and above the mere agreement of the people involved.
Can you give an example, like the verbal contract?
Sure, the stipulatio. You and I could agree I'll sell you my horse for a certain price. We shake on it. But under the old Roman civil law, unless we use the exact required question and answer formula like spondesni, do you promise this? Spondeo, I promise. There was no legally binding contract. The words themselves, the ritual, created the obligation.
So the magic was in saying the right words precisely? What about the literal contract?
That needed a specific entry in an account book, a ledger, codex. Again, the act of writing it down in the prescribed way gave it legal force. It's only the consensual contracts, things like sale, hire, partnership, mandate, the really common commercial stuff that were binding just based on mutual agreement alone. But for many core legal acts, the form was paramount.
And this emphasis on form and structure, it seems to extend right into the heart of Roman society, like the family and inheritance. There's a key distinction they made in kinship that feels very different from how we think today.
Definitely. We need to talk about cognates versus agnates. It's fundamental. Cognates are basically what we think of as blood relatives, anyone you can trace back to a common ancestor, whether through male or female links. Your mother's siblings, their children, they're all cognates.
Okay, that sounds like our modern idea of family. But agnates?
Agnates were a subset of cognates. They were only those relatives you could trace your connection to exclusively through males, without any female links breaking the chain, all under the same paterfamilias, head of household, or descended from one.
So my father's brother and his children would be agnates, but my mother's brother and his children, while being cognates, blood relatives, wouldn't be agnates in relation to me.
Exactly right. And under the oldest layers of Roman civil law, especially concerning inheritance and succession, it was the agnatic relationship that mattered most. Property, status, family religious rights, they were designed to pass down that strictly male line. It was about preserving the power and identity of the male-headed household, the familia, deeply conservative.
How did this conservative structure deal with things like marriage, especially when women owned property? And divorce became more common.
That's where it gets interesting. In the common form of marriage later on, marriage without menace, meaning the wife didn't pass into her husband's legal control, the husband technically got no rights over his wife's own property just by marrying her. She retained ownership.
That sounds quite modern, actually. Economic independence for the wife.
In principle, yes. However, there was the dues, or dowry. This was property the wife or her family brought to the marriage, and it was vested in the husband. The idea was it would help with the expenses of the household.
Okay, but what if they divorced? Did he just keep it?
No. That's where custom, and increasingly law, stepped in. There was a strong obligation for the husband to return the dues if the marriage ended, especially through divorce. This was often formalized with a stipulatio, that verbal contract, again creating a firm legal duty. As divorce became more frequent, especially among the elite, protecting the return of the dues was crucial for a woman's financial security.
Right, that makes sense. Now let's talk about a group central to the Roman world, but who existed in a strange legal void. Slaves.
Ah, yes. Roman law here was brutally clear, at least on paper. Slaves were property, red things like tools or animals. Legally, a slave couldn't own property, couldn't make a contract, couldn't sue or be sued. A slave could not really owe or be owed anything. Any transaction they made was technically void.
But slaves ran businesses, managed estates, engaged in trade all the time. How did the economy function if the people doing the work had no legal standing?
Through a brilliant legal workaround, the peculium. This was a fund or property, maybe some money, goods, even other slaves, that the master allowed the slave to possess and manage as if it were their own. Legally, it still belonged to the master, but in practice, it gave the slave significant economic agency.
So the term debt related to a slave was used loosely, as the source says.
Exactly. It wasn't a true legal debt, but everyone acted as if it were. And the law adapted pragmatically. If a third party made a deal with the slave involving the peculium, the master could usually sue that third party to recover what was owed to the slave's fund.
And could the third party sue the master if the slave didn't deliver?
Yes, crucially they could. But typically the master's liability was limited to the value of that slave's peculium. It was a clever system. It protected the master from unlimited liability. It allowed slaves to conduct business effectively, facilitating commerce, but it never challenged the fundamental legal status of the slave as property. Pure Roman pragmatism.
It's a stark example of law accommodating reality. And this tension between the slave as property and the slave as a human even shows up in philosophy, doesn't it? With Aristotle.
Yes, that famous Aristotelian distinction captures the discomfort. He said friendship might be possible with a slave, qua man, insofar as he is a human being, but not qua slave, insofar as he is a piece of property. It acknowledges the shared humanity while upholding the legal and social category, a philosophical tightrope walk.
Okay, one more group facing legal constraints. Roman women, even adult women, they were often under tutela, guardianship. Why?
The traditional justification, going way back, was supposedly their instability of judgment, levitas animi. The idea was women were too fickle, maybe too easily swayed, to manage their own financial affairs safely.
But did the Romans themselves still believe that centuries later?
Not really. The famous Juris Gaius, writing in the 2nd century AD, pretty much calls that rationale more specious than true. He acknowledges it sounds plausible, but doesn't really hold water, especially since women of full age were routinely handling their own business.
So if the reason was flimsy, why did the system of tutela persist for so long? Why did an adult woman still need a tutor's formal authorization, auctoritas, for certain acts?
It seems it persisted largely because of one critical area: controlling the most valuable forms of family property. While a tutor might be forced by the praetor, a legal official, to give his authorization for everyday things almost automatically.
There was a major exception.
Yes. A woman absolutely needed her tutor's auctoritas to alienate, meaning sell or transfer res mancipi.
And res mancipi were the big-ticket items.
Exactly. We're talking about land in Italy, slaves, draft animals like oxen and horses, and certain old agricultural rights of way. Basically the core ancestral wealth of a Roman family. By requiring a male tutor's sign-off for these specific transactions, the system ensured that ultimate control over the family's foundational capital remained, indirectly at least, in male hands, aligned with that agnatic principle we talked about. The guardianship wasn't really about protecting the woman from herself anymore. It was about protecting the traditional family estate from potentially independent female control.
Okay, let's broaden out from those specific legal categories. Thinking about law and order generally, there's an argument in our sources that justice isn't just a nice ideal, it's a fundamental requirement for any kind of life.
Yes, it's presented as an absolute necessity. The argument goes that even if you lived a completely solitary life or just farmed your own land, you'd still need the opinion or feeling of justice for your own protection and peace of mind. We need to believe fairness is possible just to function.
And Cicero uses a really striking example to hammer this home, doesn't he? Involving criminals.
He does. It's quite powerful. He argues that even people who live by crime and wrongdoing feed off wrongdoing and crime, is the phrase. Even they can't exist without some modicum of justice among themselves.
He talks about a gang of robbers.
Exactly. Think about a bandit leader. Their gang operates on trust and mutual benefit, however twisted. If that leader doesn't divide the loot fairly, if he violates their internal code of justice, what happens? Cicero says he's either killed or abandoned by his allies.
So even among thieves, there has to be some honor, some fairness for the group to hold together.
Precisely. It demonstrates that justice, or at least perceived fairness in distributing gains and losses, isn't just a fancy civic virtue imposed from above. It's a basic operational requirement for any group that wants to function, suggesting it's almost like a natural law inherent in human social interaction.
If justice is that fundamental, then punishment must be too, for maintaining order. What was the general Roman attitude towards punishment, especially severe punishment like the death penalty? Were they squeamish about it?
Squeamish is probably not the word. The sources suggest a relative lack of what we might term modern bleeding hearts. The dominant value seems to have been utilitas public utility, the greater good, maintaining social order above all else.
And this meant the death penalty wasn't controversial.
During the Empire, the Principate, it seems to have made a strong comeback and was widely accepted, justified by precedent and this idea of public utility. Order was paramount.
Any examples of this kind of ruthless practicality?
Well, Augustus executed political rivals like Caepio and Murena with apparently little public outcry. Perhaps even more stark is the attitude towards slaves. There was a law. If a master was murdered in his home, all slaves living under that roof could be executed, regardless of whether they were involved or even knew about it.
All of them. As a deterrent.
Yes. The infamous case involving Pedanius Secundus's household led to the execution of hundreds of slaves. While there might have been some unease, major protests, the sources suggest, tended to come from special interest groups, perhaps those economically affected, rather than a widespread moral objection. Collective security and deterrence generally prompt individual justice or mercy in these situations.
That focus on order and utility also seems connected to how the Roman state itself grew, especially its administration in the later empire. It became much more professionalized.
That's a really key development. In the earlier periods, a lot of the day-to-day administrative work, even in the emperor's household, was done by slaves and freedmen, highly capable individuals, but still part of that private household structure.
But that changed.
Significantly, yes. As the empire grew more complex, managing vast territories, sophisticated taxation, huge military logistics, that reliance on an informal, semi-private staff wasn't enough.
So they needed a proper civil service.
Exactly. You see a shift towards soldiers and members of the senatorial and equestrian classes choosing careers specifically in administration. They replaced the slaves and freedmen in many key roles. The sources talk about a huge increase in the state's official administrative staff. One estimate mentions a hundredfold increase, although we need to be careful with specific numbers as it depends who you were counting before.
But the trend is clear.
Yeah.
A bigger, more professional state bureaucracy.
Undeniably. It marks a transition from an empire run almost like an extension of noble households to a more impersonal, centrally managed state with a dedicated professional class running it, essential for managing that vast, complex entity.
Okay, let's wrap up with one final insight into Roman legal thinking. How did their jurists handle change? They needed the law to adapt to include non-citizens, new provinces, but they also deeply respected tradition. How did they square that circle?
They were masters of the legal fiction.
Fictions. You mean pretending something was true when it wasn't?
Essentially, yes, but in a very clever, technical way. A legal fiction is a mechanism that allows you to apply a rule to a situation it wasn't originally intended for without actually changing the old rule itself.
How would that work in practice?
Say you have a law that only applies to Roman citizens, but you need it to cover a transaction involving a foreigner. Instead of rewriting the law, the praetor might instruct the judge to proceed as if the foreigner were a citizen for the purposes of this specific case. The original law remains intact, venerated, but its practical scope has been massively expanded.
So they could say they were honoring the old principles.
Exactly. The sources say jurists described later laws as honoring the principles articulated in earlier legislation, even while these new procedures were subtly working to subvert those same principles. It allowed for evolution and pragmatism while maintaining the appearance of absolute continuity and conservatism. The fiction was the engine of legal change, hidden beneath a veneer of tradition. Brilliant, really. Hashtag tag outro.
Wow. Okay, we have journeyed a long way. From Athenian assemblies judging character and, well, using radishes for justice,
Yes.
all the way to the intricate formalism of Roman contracts and the ingenious use of legal fictions to manage slaves and foreigners. I think the big takeaway for me is this constant tension, this paradox around power and compulsion.
I agree. You see it everywhere. Sparta's power collapsing because its own rules were too rigid. Athens funding its empire through voluntary service that everyone knew was actually compulsory. Rome building this incredibly formal legal structure but relying on subtle fictions to make it actually work for a vast, diverse empire.
It seems like the ancient world was in this perpetual negotiation between the freedom of the individual, or at least the citizen, and the demands of the state, whether that state was a city or a massive empire.
Absolutely. They were constantly trying to figure out where that line was, how to balance stability and order with custom, liberty, and practicality. And the Romans, perhaps, became the masters of managing that friction through law, making it look unchanging even as it adapted.
So, reflecting on all this, it shows that whether it was fighting wars or arguing in court or defining family ties, they were always grappling with individual rights versus state power, tradition versus necessity.
Which leads us to a final thought, something for you to maybe chew on. We talked quite a bit about Roman family law, that crucial distinction between cognates, all your blood relatives, and agnates, only those related exclusively through the male line.
Right, and how agnates were key for inheritance and power.
Exactly. Now think about that. A hugely sophisticated legal system defined who you were, who you inherited from, not just by biology, but by this very specific male-centric lineage. So here's the question. How much of our own modern legal thinking about family, inheritance, property, maybe even corporate structures or ideas of succession, how much of that is still subtly shaped, perhaps unconsciously, by the ghost of that ancient Roman male-centric agnatic tradition? Is it still influencing how we define connection and obligation today? Something to consider as you navigate the complexities of the modern world.